The recording starts mid-sentence. That was the first thing fleet analyst Vareth noticed. Not the content, not the transmission frequency, not even the species designation stamped in the corner of the file. Just that the recording had been captured already in progress, as if whatever had generated it didn't need a beginning. 41 seconds of audio, no encryption, no carrier wave, no origin point the sensors could triangulate. And underneath it, underneath the voices, underneath the static that wasn't quite static, something that made the translation algorithm pause for 0.003 seconds before rendering an output. That pause had never happened before. Vareth flagged the file and set it aside. The jamming grid was active, had been active for 6 days across every band the humans used. Nothing was getting through. Nothing was getting out. So what he was holding wasn't possible. He almost deleted it. He would spend the rest of his life wishing he had. 6 days earlier, the Keth Dominion's 3rd expeditionary fleet had arrived at the edge of the system humans called Sol, with a mandate so clean it barely required explanation. Establish communication dominance, demonstrate technological supremacy, and await the formal surrender that all projections indicated would follow within 72 standard hours. The Dominion had done this 11 times before, 11 species, 11 clean endings. The math was simple. The Keth jamming array, 16 capital ships arranged in a modified Haverson lattice, could suppress every frequency band between 3 Hz and 300 GHz simultaneously across a volume of space roughly equivalent to the entire human inner system. Radio, microwave, lasercom relays, subspace burst transmitters, all of it gone. The humans would be isolated from each other, blind, unable to coordinate, unable to share intelligence, unable to even know where their own ships were in relation to one another. An army that cannot communicate cannot fight. This was not a theory. This was 11 data points, 11 confirmations, 11 species that had looked at the silence the Keth created and understood, correctly, that it was over. Fleet Commander Dresch had reviewed the human military assessments twice before issuing the activation order. 17,000 active warships, impressive by regional standards, distributed across 4 planetary systems with dense communication networks linking every command node. Take out the network, and you take out the coherence. Take out the coherence, and 17,000 ships become 17,000 individual, uncoordinated problems rather than one coordinated threat. She had given the order at 600 standard. By 610, every human signal in the inner system had gone dark. By 640, Dresch had begun drafting the terms of the ceasefire she fully expected to be negotiating by end of day. The first anomaly appeared at 700. Commander, Tactical Officer Shen's voice carried the particular careful flatness of someone reporting something they had already checked 3 times because they didn't believe it the first 2. Human vessel movement in Sector 9. Formation intact. Dresch looked up from her draft. Define intact. Unchanged from pre-jamming configuration. Delta Wing, 17 ships, moving on bearing 271 as if Shen paused. As if they received an order. Run the sensor sweep again. I've run it 4 times. Silence in the command center. The kind of silence that happens when a room full of very intelligent people simultaneously reaches the edge of their model of the world and find nothing on the other side. They're guessing, said Dresch finally. Pre-planned movement. The order was already in place before we activated the grid. That's possible, said Shen, except, another pause, he was doing it again, checking before he said it. Except they changed heading 12 minutes after we activated. They shouldn't have known to change heading. They couldn't have received a new order. Dresch set down her draft. Show me. What the tactical display showed was simple and should have been impossible. The human Delta Wing hadn't just maintained formation. It had asterisk adapted asterisk. A Keth patrol cluster had moved to intercept on the assumption that the isolated ships would either scatter or hold position, both of which were tactically predictable. The human wing had done neither. It had rotated, compressed, and angled toward a gap that the patrol cluster created by moving, a gap that hadn't existed until 20 seconds before the human ships began moving toward it. They had predicted the patrol's movement. Or they had received information about it. "Scan for everything," said Dresch. "Light-based, gravitational, particle, anything we're not suppressing." The scans ran. The scans found nothing. Shen was quiet for a long moment before he said, "Commander, I want to note formally that I have no explanation for this." "Noted," said Dresch. "Flag it and continue suppression. Their coordination will degrade. It has to." She believed that, completely, rationally, based on 11 previous data points. She was wrong in a way she could not yet imagine. Verath had been assigned to the Signals Intelligence Division precisely because he was thorough. Other analysts moved faster. Verath moved carefully, which meant that when everyone else had spent 6 days cataloging the satisfying silence of a successful jamming operation, Verath had been cataloging the silence itself, the texture of it, the shape of it. Silence, he had learned, was not uniform. Every jamming field had what he privately called a asterisk shadow, not a gap exactly, not a frequency the array missed, but a residue, an interference pattern created by the suppression itself. The way a hand pressed flat against still water doesn't eliminate the water, it just changes its geometry. Verath had written 2 papers on this phenomenon that had been read by exactly 4 people in the Dominion's analytical core, all of whom had filed them under interesting but practically irrelevant. On day 3 of the operation, Verath found the shadow. It was not a signal, not in any technical definition he could apply. It had no modulation, no carrier, no encoding he recognized. It was more like a asterisk rhythm in the interference pattern itself. A structure, something almost biological in its irregularity, which was precisely what made it hard to dismiss. He spent 2 days building a filter to isolate it. What came out the other end was the 41-second recording that began mid-sentence. He spent another 6 hours running translation algorithms before he had something that resembled meaning. And when he did, he stared at the output for a very long time. Then he walked it down to Commander Dresch's office without sending a message ahead, because sending a message felt, suddenly, like a very fragile thing to do. Dresch read the translation twice. "This is what they're transmitting," she said. It was not a question. "This is what I believe they're transmitting, through the shadow interference of our own jamming array." Verath kept his voice level. "They've turned our suppression field into a medium." "How?" "I don't know." "How long have they been doing it?" "I believe," he stopped, started again. "I believe they were doing it before we arrived." Dresch looked up. "The array type we deployed," said Verath, "is not a secret. The Dominion has used variants of it in 11 prior operations. The specifications are not published, but they are inferable from observable effects. I think they studied the previous operations and he gestured at the translation on her desk. They built a system designed to function asterisk inside the shadow." The translation read, "Echo Cell 47, bearing correction follows." Not a distress call, not a surrender request, not even a battle order in any conventional sense. A bearing correction, navigation data, passed ship to ship through the interference pattern of the weapon designed to stop them from communicating. "They expected to be jammed," said Dresch slowly. "They planned for it," said Verath, "before we arrived, possibly years before." The room felt different after that. The same room, same walls, same display screens showing the satisfying silence of a successful suppression operation. But different. The way a room feels different when you realize the locked door you've been standing behind is not locked from your side. "Get me Shen," said Dresh. "Get me everyone." The tactical meeting lasted 4 hours, and by the end of it, 3 things had been established with something approaching certainty. First, the humans were communicating through the jamming field, using an encoding method that piggybacked on the interference shadow the array itself generated. The signal was slow, drastically slower than conventional communication, but functional. Ships could exchange position data, bearing corrections, and what appeared to be short operational codes. Second, they had been doing this for at least 6 days, meaning the entire period of supposed communications blackout had in fact been, from the human perspective, a degraded but functional communications environment. Third, and this was the one that made Shen's voice go quiet in a way Verath hadn't heard before, the encoding method the humans were using was *specific* to the Keth-Haverson lattice configuration, not to jamming arrays in general, not to suppression fields as a category. To this exact array type, this exact lattice geometry. "They reverse-engineered our weapon," said Shen. "They reverse-engineered our weapon's shadow asterisk," Verath corrected. "Which is harder? Our weapon is a thing. Its shadow is a byproduct. It doesn't have a consistent signature. It varies based on local conditions, array calibration, even the gravitational gradient of nearby bodies. To predict its shape precisely enough to encode through it." He stopped, because the mathematics of what he was describing were starting to make him feel something he didn't have immediate language for. "How long," said Dresh, "how long would it take to develop this?" "Years," said Verath, "minimum, possibly a decade." No one spoke. "They've been preparing for us," said Shen finally, "for a decade." "They've been preparing for our jamming grid," said Verath, "for a decade, which means they knew we were coming," said Dresh. "Or," said Verath carefully, because this was the part that had kept him awake, "they didn't know we were coming. They just knew something like us was coming, and they built for it anyway." The misinterpretation, when it came fully into focus for Verath later that night, was almost elegant in its completeness. The Dominion had looked at the humans' distributed communication networks, radio, laser relay, subspace burst, and seen dependency. Seen fragility. 11 prior species had shown them what dependency looked like. Take away the network, take away the cohesion, take away the fight. The Dominion had looked at the humans and seen the same pattern. What they had not seen, what they had been in some structural way unable to see from outside, was that the humans had looked at the same network and seen a liability had spent years looking at their own dependency and asking, what do we do when this is gone? Not if when. The distributed networks weren't their primary communication strategy. They were the visible layer, the one they expected to lose. Underneath it, invisible, there had always been something else. "I need to send a report to High Command," said Dresh, and Verath heard something in her voice he had not heard from a fleet commander before. The particular tension of someone who has discovered a thing and cannot yet explain how it changes everything, but knows with absolute certainty that it does. "The array adjustment," she continued. "If we modify the lattice geometry, we eliminate the shadow. We close the channel they're using." "Yes," said Verath. "How quickly can they adapt?" He thought about a decade of preparation, about a species that had looked at its own vulnerability and built an architecture around it, about the fact that the encoding was specific not just to the Haverson lattice, but to its shadow which meant they understood the mathematics of suppression deeply enough to. "I don't know," he said honestly. "That's not reassuring." "No, it isn't." She was quiet for a moment. Outside the viewport, the human inner system glittered in the dark, 17,000 ships moving in patterns that should have been random but weren't, coordinating in silence that wasn't silence, fighting a war that the Dominion had designed to be over before it started. "Varath," said Dresh, "in your assessment, what are they doing right now? Not the ships, the people, the individual humans making decisions in those ships. What are they doing?" It was not a question he'd expected from a fleet commander. It wasn't a tactical question. "They're talking," he said, slowly, through our weapon to each other. He paused. "I think they've been waiting for this. Not hoping it wouldn't happen, waiting for it to happen so they could prove the system worked." Dresh turned back to the viewport. "Modify the array," she said quietly, "and then tell me what they do next." The array modification took 11 hours. When the new lattice geometry activated, the shadow changed shape. The specific interference pattern the humans had been exploiting collapsed, replaced by a different and far less predictable residue. Varath monitored the human formation for the first hour after the change. Then the second hour. Then on the edge of the third hour, he saw it. Not a return to chaos. Not the scatter and isolate pattern that 11 prior species had demonstrated when communication was finally, truly severed. The human delta wing, still in formation, still coherent, changed its encoding method. Not to a different shadow exploitation. To something else entirely. Something Varath watched for 40 minutes before he realized, with a cold that had nothing to do with temperature, what he was looking at. "Shen," he said into the comm channel, "come to my station right now. I'm in the middle of..." "Now." Shen appeared beside him 2 minutes later, looked at the display, looked at the pattern. "What am I seeing?" he said. They switched to timed burst pulses through the navigation beacons. Varath's voice was very controlled. "The positioning beacons we use for our own ships. They've been injecting micropulses into the beacon signal, not enough to alter its function for us, but enough to carry encoded data in the gap between pulses. We've been broadcasting their communication system for them for 11 hours without knowing it." Shen stared at the display. "They have multiple," he said. "They have multiple backup systems. At least 3 that I can identify, and those are only the ones that have activated so far." "How many do they have?" Varath thought about a species that had spent a decade looking at their own fragility, and deciding the answer was not to be less fragile, but to build so many redundant layers beneath the fragility that losing any single one barely registered. "I don't know," he said. "I don't think we should assume we've found all of them." Shen sat down heavily in the chair beside him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "They're not trying to restore communications," Shen said finally. "Are they?" "No. They never lost communications. Not really. What we took from them was..." "Convenience," said Varath. "We took away the convenient layer, and they'd already built everything worth keeping underneath it." Dresh's response to the navigation beacon discovery was surgical, a complete shutdown of the Dominion's own positioning beacons in the operational theater. A significant risk, Keth ships relied on beacon triangulation for precision maneuvering in tight formation, but a manageable one. Keth navigators were trained for beacon-dark environments. It was an edge case, not a crisis. Within 4 hours, the human Delta Wing had shifted to a third encoding method. They were using light. Not lasercom. Lasercom was suppressed. Something older. Something so old that Varath's initial scan dismissed it as sensor artifact before he thought to run it through the historical Xeno communication database, and found a match in a file stamped with a date that made him read it twice. "This is light-based binary encoding," he said. "Physical, visible spectrum pulses, ship-running light modulation." He looked up from the display. "This is a human communication method from before they developed radio." Shen looked at him. "They're using asterisk light signals," said Varath, "like their ancient sailors used on water, ship-to-ship line of sight." "We can jam that," said Shen immediately. light suppression. Would require repositioning 6 capital ships to create overlapping coverage in this sector. Vareth pulled up the geometry, which opens a corridor on the ecliptic. He highlighted it. Here. Shen studied the corridor. Then he looked at the human delta wing, then back at the corridor. That's not a coincidence, he said quietly. No, said Vareth, it's not. The humans were not just communicating through the jamming field. They were communicating about the jamming field. Every suppression method the Dominion deployed, every countermeasure, every adjustment. The information was moving through the human formation in real time, being analyzed, being responded to. The Delta Wing's current position and bearing. Vareth realized with something that felt like vertigo, was not a coincidence either. They were positioned at the exact location where light signal communication between their ships would be most difficult to block without creating exactly the corridor Shen was looking at. They had set this up, moved into position for a contingency that required predicting not just the Dominion's initial jamming, but its first 3 responses to human countermeasures. They planned for our response to their plan, said Shen, and our response to that. Yes. How far does it go? Vareth didn't answer. He was looking at something on his display, not the Delta Wing, not the communication analysis, but the broader tactical map, the whole inner system. Shen, he said slowly, how many of our suppression adjustments have required us to reposition assets? Shen pulled up the log. 6, 7 including the beacon shutdown. And how many of those repositioned assets created temporary coverage gaps? A long silence. All of them, said Shen. And the human fleet's movements over the past 6 days run their trajectories against those gaps. Shen ran the analysis. He ran it again. His voice when he spoke was very quiet. They've been through every gap. Not randomly, said Vareth. In sequence. In the exact order we created the gaps. He turned from the display. Shen, we didn't disrupt their communication. We've been directing their fleet for 6 days while thinking we were blinding them. This was the moment. Vareth would understand later, reviewing his own logs with the cold hindsight of someone assembling an after-action report for an audience that had not yet grasped what they were reading. This was the moment when the Dominion's model of the situation stopped being wrong in small, recoverable ways and began being wrong in large, structural ones. The misconception was not about communications. Communications was the surface. The misconception was about what the humans were optimizing for . The Dominion had assumed, as it had assumed with 11 previous species, that a military force's primary goal was to maintain capability, to preserve, to protect its own function. The humans were not optimizing to preserve their communication capability. They were optimizing to understand the Dominion's decision-making pattern. Every backup system they activated, every encoding method they switched to, every response to every Keth countermeasure, it wasn't just communication. It was data collection. Every time the Dominion reacted, the humans learned something. The jamming field had been running for 6 days, and in 6 days the humans had mapped the Dominion's response hierarchy, their asset prioritization, their tolerance thresholds, their tactical habits. 6 days of the Dominion thinking it was winning had given the humans everything they needed to know about how the Dominion thought. They baited us, said Dresh. Her voice was very flat. The communication networks, the ones we suppressed, they weren't their real system. They were bait, said Vareth. Yes. They showed us a dependency they'd already decided to sacrifice. And spent a decade making sure that when we took it, we'd spend 6 days doing exactly what they needed us to do while believing we were winning. Dresh was quiet for a long time. How many of our tactical decisions in the past 6 days have they anticipated? I can't know that, but Commander, Verath paused, because the next part was important and he wanted to say it correctly. The appropriate question might not be how many decisions they've anticipated. It might be whether any decision we make from this point is one they haven't already planned for. The silence that followed was a different quality of silence than any that had come before it. Outside the viewport, 17,000 human ships moved in patterns that were not random and had never been random and had been, from the very beginning, a conversation the Dominion hadn't known it was having. On the 7th day, the humans stopped being subtle. The Delta Wing, still in formation, still coordinating through whatever channel Verath hadn't found yet, because there was always one he hadn't found yet, accelerated toward the gap on the ecliptic. Not cautiously, at full combat speed in a tight wedge configuration, and Verath watched on his display as 6 other human formations across the inner system simultaneously began moving with a coherence that should have been impossible and wasn't. "All formations are moving," Shen reported. "Coordinated, simultaneous." "How?" said Dresh. Not rhetorical. Genuinely asking because the analysis teams had been monitoring every frequency, every shadow, every possible channel, and none of them were showing active human transmission. Verath stared at his display. The human fleet was moving as a single coordinated unit, 17,000 ships, and there was no signal. There was no shadow. There was nothing. And then slowly he understood. Not all of it, not even most of it, but enough. "They don't need signals anymore," he said. Shen turned, Dresh turned. "The past 6 days," said Verath. "The communication through the jamming shadow, through the beacon gaps, through the light pulses. They weren't just maintaining coordination." He was working it out as he spoke. They were distributing a plan, the complete operational plan. Every ship, every unit, every contingency, passed through in pieces over 6 days. "They don't need real-time communication," said Shen slowly, "because they already know what to do. Every ship knows the plan. Every commander knows their role and every contingency and the decision tree for every Dominion response. They don't need to talk to each other anymore because the conversation is already over." Verath looked up from his display. "They used the 6 days we gave them to become a system that doesn't require communication. Every individual unit is carrying the whole picture." "They planned for the jamming," said Dresh. "They planned for the jamming being extended," said Verath. "They planned for us finding the shadow channel and shutting it down. They planned for us finding the beacon method. They planned for all of it. The communication systems we were so focused on disrupting, they were always temporary. They only needed them long enough to make every ship self-sufficient." He looked at the display. 17,000 ships, moving in silence, needing nothing from each other, needing nothing from any signal, from any frequency, from any channel the Dominion could reach. "They made themselves immune to us," he said, "and we helped them do it." The battle, when it came, lasted 9 hours. Verath did not watch most of it. He was in the signal intelligence bay, searching for communication channels that weren't there, while the tactical updates arrived in bursts that told a story he found increasingly difficult to process. The human fleet did not fight like a fleet. It fought like a distributed organism. Formations split and recombined. Units that appeared to be retreating were flanking. Ships that appeared to be holding position were delaying, drawing Keth assets into corridors, into geometries that other human units were already moving to exploit. The movements had an internal logic that became, over 9 hours, progressively more legible. But only once you understood the plan they'd been transmitting to each other in pieces for 6 days. The Keth formations responded, adapted, sent orders through their own communication channels, repositioned, reinforced. Each response was correct by the model Dresh and her commanders were working from. The model was 6 days old. 6 days of data collection the humans had conducted while the Dominion thought it was winning. Every Keth response matched a human contingency. Verath received a brief message from Dresh at hour 6. 3 words, no tactical context, sent through the Dominion's own encrypted channels, which he now realized the humans might also be monitoring. How much more? He thought about that for a long time. How much more were the humans willing to lose? The battle had cost them. He pulled the running casualty assessments, hundreds of ships. Not thousands, hundreds. But each loss was deliberate, he'd come to understand. Each sacrifice was a tactical decision made by a commander who had the full plan, who knew what the sacrifice bought, who had chosen it. He thought about a species that had looked at its own vulnerability and decided to become, systematically, intentionally, comprehensively, more difficult to stop than they were possible to predict. He thought about a species that had spent a decade preparing for a scenario designed to render them helpless, and whose response to helplessness had been to quietly become something else entirely. He sent back 4 words, "I don't think there is one." The Keth 3rd Expeditionary Fleet withdrew at hour 9. Not en route in calculation, which was almost worse. Dresh made the call with the same analytical clarity she'd applied to everything, which was the clarity of someone who had recognized that the cost of continuing to engage was now higher than the cost of the information lost and the tactical ground ceded. It was a correct military decision, rational, defensible. And the humans let them go. That was the part Verath could not stop thinking about, reviewing it later, writing the report that High Command would read in silence before asking him to come to Dominion Prime to explain it in person. The humans had the geometry to press the engagement. They had the positioning, the coherence, the momentum. They had Keth assets in configurations that would have allowed significant additional attrition. They let the fleet go. Why? Said Shen, and Verath heard in his voice the same thing he felt. Not outrage, not relief, but something stranger. A question that felt like it had more levels than could be immediately seen. Verath looked at the human formations as they returned, smoothly, to their pre-engagement positions, as if reoccupying rooms in a house. "Because they want us to go back," he said, "and report." Shen stared at him. "They want High Command to know," said Verath, "what they built, what it cost to find it, what happened when you took their signals away." He paused. "They're not trying to win a battle, they're trying to change a calculation, the Dominion's calculation about what humanity costs." "They're sending a message," said Shen. "Without any signal at all." The report Verath filed to High Command was the longest of his career and the most precisely worded, because he understood that every word would be read by people who had not seen what he'd seen and would need to have it built for them carefully, layer by layer, the way the humans had built their contingencies. He started with the 41-second recording. He ended with a single observation. In 11 prior operations, the Dominion suppression of communications was the decisive act. The targeted species, deprived of coordination, ceased to function as a coherent military force. In this operation, the suppression of communications was also decisive, but not in the way we intended. The humans used the period of suppression to complete a process that the existence of communications had apparently prevented. They distributed their entire operational plan, unit by unit, commander by commander, until no single point of failure remained. Until no signal was necessary, until no jamming field, no matter how comprehensive, no matter how precisely engineered, could reach the thing they had actually built. They did not defend their communications network. They used its destruction as the trigger for becoming something that does not need one. I have spent 3 days attempting to identify what we could have done differently. The answer I keep arriving at is uncomfortable. Nothing. From the moment we activated the array, we were executing their plan. The only variable we controlled was how long it took us to understand that. The Keth Dominion has suppressed 11 species. In each case, the decisive advantage was the assumption that communication networks represent a species' true coordination capacity. For 11 species, this was correct. For humanity, communication networks are what they show you. Beneath them is something they have spent decades making sure they never have to show anyone. I do not know how far down it goes. I am not certain anyone does. Years later, there would be researchers, Keth, Vorath, Seln, others, who would study the Sol campaign with the meticulous retrospective attention that disasters tend to generate. They would reconstruct the timeline. They would trace the encoding methods. They would find in the declassified Dominion records Verath's 41-second recording and the translation output, and the 0.003-second pause in the algorithm, and they would debate what exactly had caused that pause. The dominant theory for a while was that the algorithm had encountered an unfamiliar signal structure, that the pause was a processing artifact, nothing meaningful. Verath, who outlived most of the researchers by virtue of being very careful about what he agreed to eat at diplomatic functions, had a different interpretation. He'd never published it. He'd mentioned it only once, to Shen, in a bar on Dominion Prime late enough in the evening that the words felt like confession rather than analysis. I think the algorithm paused, he said, because the translation was straightforward. Echo cell 47 bearing correction follows, simple, mundane, tactical notation. He turned his glass in his hands. The pause was because the algorithm recognized it was hearing the middle of a conversation that had been going on for a very long time, and it didn't know how to mark that in the output. It didn't have a field for, this has been happening longer than you thought, and you are not at the beginning of this story. Shen was quiet for a moment. Do you think they knew, he said, before we arrived? Do you think they knew exactly what would happen? Verath thought about a species that had looked at its own communication dependency and spent a decade constructing something beneath it. That had designed a system to function inside the shadow of a weapon they'd never seen, based on inference alone. That had used 6 days of enforced silence to complete a transformation they'd apparently been working toward for years, waiting for the right pressure to trigger it. That had let the fleet go, because winning the battle mattered less than changing the calculation. No, he said finally, I don't think they knew exactly. I think they prepared for everything they could imagine and trusted that they were ready for the rest. He set down his glass. That's the part I still can't properly explain to high command. It's not that they were smarter than us. It's not that their technology was better or their commanders were more capable. It's that they looked at the worst case, the scenario designed to make them helpless, and their response was to build the helplessness into the foundation, to make it structural, to decide, before we ever arrived, that losing everything they were supposed to depend on was not an ending but a beginning. He looked at the table. We took their signals. We thought we took their voice. He shook his head slowly. We gave them 11 days of silence, and they used it to become the only thing in the galaxy that silence cannot stop. Somewhere in the dark behind that thought, the 41-second recording played on, unchanged, mid-sentence, the way it had always played. Not at the beginning of something, not at the end, but exactly in the middle. Evidence of a conversation that had been going on long before anyone thought to listen, and would go on in the shadow of every weapon raised against it, long after every rational civilization